Thank you, Megan. I should start again. So this is the first session of our track 2 R3 cohort 3 trainings. And this is going to be every Wednesday at 11 o'clock, where we're going to take some of the topics that we know have been more challenging
You can't get on.
in the past, and we're going to drill down on those topics. So today we're going to talk about allowable costs and executive compensation. Oops. There we go. So as always, we're going to keep everyone's microphone muted, and we're going to ask you to stay muted throughout the whole presentation because we are recording this session and we want to have a really good quality recording that we can share after each session, right? But we do want to hear from you, so we want you to use the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen to share any questions that you have. And we're going to be stopping periodically throughout this hour to read off and respond to your questions. And as I said, we're being recorded, and we're going to send everybody who's on my contact list, we're going to send everybody an email that from this email address, cja.r3training@illinois.gov. We're going to use that email address to send you an email after every session that will include the training recording, as well as a PDF of the PowerPoint, and then a kind of a summary of the key points from each of the trainings. We will also offer you the opportunity to add new people to the contact list. It's very rare that there's one person at a grantee agency that is the only person that needs to know a lot of this detail on, programmatic reporting, on financial reporting, on record keeping. And so we're going to invite you to add people from your agency to the contact list if you think it will be helpful for them to get the invitations or your trainings and to receive those follow-up emails. So please use that same email address, cja.r3training@illinois.gov, and tell me the staff member's name, their role in the grant, and then the staff member email. You should probably also tell me the agency. That would be helpful too. So today we just have 4 things on the agenda. We're going to talk about budgets 101, cost allowability, executive compensation, and some cost allowability resources that we're going to provide you as well. So all of our cohort 3 grantees right now are just beginning the execution phase of their agreement that we kind of went through last Thursday. And one of the pieces that is probably the most detailed and the most time consuming in this part of the execution process is looking at your budget, right? So when your grant specialist is reviewing your application materials, there are some basic things that they're looking at. For one thing, they want to make sure that the math makes sense. We have a very detailed budget, and sometimes grantees may misunderstand how to complete that form to get to the number that they need, that total cost for that line item. So there are often corrections there or revisions there to make sure that the math works correctly based on the template that we have. Another common thing is that the budget narrative may not be there for every single line item in the detailed budget. And that budget narrative, especially as we go to today's presentation, you'll see more and more, is really important to us because that's where you're going to be telling us why each line item is necessary for the program and how those cost estimates were determined. So very basically, we're going to be looking to, your specialist will be looking to see that your materials are consistent across the grant agreement and the budget. So they're going to be looking at that program description and your goals, objectives, and performance measures, how you're planning to implement this program, and they're going to be looking at that budget. I always want to make sure that there are no surprise items in the budget. I've seen some grants where I read the program narrative and I think I understand what they're going to be doing, and then I get to the budget and there are all sorts of other items in the budget that really weren't reflected in that program narrative. So that's one of the things the specialists are looking for, is a real correspondence between the description of what's going to happen and the costs that are necessary to make that program happen. We want to make sure that the materials clearly support the program activity and the costs, and that they conform to the cost principles and program guidelines. The most common changes at this phase is that there may be missing or incomplete budget narrative, because that's where you're going to be telling us why those costs, each line item's costs, are reasonable and necessary for the program. Oftentimes the supplies are detailed on the equipment tab. The difference between a supply and an equipment is equipment are items that have a unit cost of $5,000 or more, and very few of our programs actually have items that are going to be procuring items that have a unit cost of more than $5,000. Oftentimes on the travel page, the rates that are used are incorrect, or they may not be current. That's, the mileage reimbursement rate or the lodging rates if you're doing any travel out of state. Those rates may not be current, so that may be some adjustments that your specialist will be working with you on during this phase of the execution. Another one that we've seen more and more is that 1099 staff are listed as personnel. And I want to talk about that in a little more detail, how we see the difference between personnel and 1099 staff. So personnel are people who are doing work on the program, that are eligible for FICA and other fringe benefits. They work under the direction of the agency. They report to you. They submit timesheets that are approved by a supervisor at your agency, and that personnel receives a W-2. So an example might be a new reentry program advocate that's going to be hired to work on this newly funded program. By contrast, a 1099 employee is an independent contractor. And so you're not going to be paying their FICA, and you're not going to be issuing them a W-2. They're an independent worker. They provide services to you, and they can provide services to other agencies as well. They typically don't submit timesheets for the work that they do for your program, and they work independent of the direction of the agency. As I said, they can be providing the same service to another organization. So a contractual trainer is a good example of a 1099 employee. Another example might be an accounting service that you use. They provide accounting services to you, but they may have, a number of clients that they provide those services to. They're independent of you. They provide services to you, but their work is, you don't direct their work. So one of the reasons that we want to spend a little time on allowability is that only the costs that are detailed in the approved budget, the budgets that you and your specialist are working on now to craft this grant agreement, only those approved budget items can be charged to the grant. And any unallowable costs that are charged to the agreement will not be reimbursed. So that's why we spend a lot of time at the authority up front in the development of the agreement. And as you saw last week, first the grant staff look at your budgets and your program materials, then it goes to our fiscal office. They look for at the budget very closely, and then our legal staff look at it as well before everybody approves it and sends it out to you for signature. So we try to work out all of these details up front so there are no surprises later. And we work very hard to make sure that there are no unallowable costs that are charged to the agreement, because we won't be able to reimburse them for you. So when we talk about cost allowability, when the GATA legislation was passed a number of years ago, the state of Illinois adopted the federal cost allowability that's detailed here at 2 CFR 200. That's the catalog of federal regulations. And it's really very detailed. We wanted to kind of walk you through some common allowability issues that we run into. The key principle you'll see as we discuss these different budget categories is that the key principle for cost allowability is all costs that are charged to the agreement that we pay you for must be both reasonable and necessary to the implementation of the program. They must all really clearly support the program. They must be directly support the program. And that's where the budget narrative comes in, because it will explain why each and every line item in that budget is needed, and it will detail how you came up with those cost estimates. So here are some of the examples. Here's a pretty straightforward one. This is pretty black and white. In this example, a new R3 reentry program will support 3 reentry counselors who will be hired for the program, 1 data specialist, and 1 reentry manager who will oversee this new program. How many laptops should we expect to see in their budget? 5 is the limit. So we'll allow you to have a new laptop for each of these new staff members. And that budget narrative is going to tell us why each of them need a laptop to do their work. And it will tell us how you came up with the cost estimate for how much that laptop is going to cost. Some typical language that we see in that budget narrative for items like this is that, well, I just bought laptops for another program that we have, so I know that that's the current rate for the laptop that's compatible and that meets the needs of my program. Another one might be, well, when I was developing this application, I did a call around, I did an internet search to see how much laptops are costing now that have the capacity that I need for this program. That's the kind of information that we're looking for in the budget narrative that helps us determine that those cost estimates are necessary and reasonable. In this second example, this is another one that we see fairly frequently. You're going to be procuring some new space, leasing some new space to house this new reentry program and 2 other programs, and in this example, an employment program and a youth outreach program. So how much should you be charging for this lease? How much of it should be charged to this reentry program? This one is going to be a little more difficult, not quite as black and white as the laptop question. You're going to be prorating that leased expense for the appropriate charge, the appropriate share of that lease that will be supporting this reentry program that's funded through the grant. So the budget narrative will tell you how you calculated that proration and for the space that will be used by this program. Maybe these 5 staff members that are going to be supported by the program will each have an office, but those other programs that aren't funded by the grant, they'll have 5 offices as well. So I would say a fair estimate would be a 50-50 proration. 50% of that lease cost will be charged to this grant agreement because 50% of the space is going to be support for this program. If those other 2 programs also have recreation space and conference space that won't be used by this program, then we may ask you to figure out the square footage and use that square footage as the calculation for the proration of how many square feet will support these 5 offices for this program, as opposed to all the rest of the space that's going to be leased to support the other programs. So that's proration. So that's a little more complicated. Now we're going to get more complicated with this example. What if our new grantee wants to send all 5 grant staff that are supported by this grant and 3 other staff members to a national reentry conference? How much of these conference costs can be charged to the grant agreement? Well, we're going to ask a couple more questions. Do all 3 of the counselors, do all 5 staff members really need to go to this conference? Do we have to have all 3 counselors? Is there a role for the data specialist at this reentry conference? Why would it be necessary for them to go? And who are these other staff members that you want to send to this conference as well? I would say it would be pretty hard to justify other folks who aren't supported by the program going to this reentry conference and charging it to this grant. We also want to know when the conference is going to take place. because all costs charged to the agreement has to be incurred during the period of performance. I've often run into the circumstance where a grantee will want to send the staff that are supported by a grant to a conference that happens after the grant ends. But they're like, well, what if I just pay all the costs during the period of performance and then they go to the conference after the grant is over? The answer for that is always going to be no, because all of the activity that's supported by these grant funds has to happen during the period of performance. So you can see, based on like the category, the answer for cost allowability isn't always just a really clear black and white like the laptops. And so your grant specialist is going to be working with you to kind of tease out those details so that by the time we send it on to the fiscal and legal office, we have a really clear statement of why each of those costs are reasonable and necessary. And now, the reasonable and necessary also apply to the staff that are charged to the agreement and to their salaries. So we'll also be looking at that. And so you'll need to provide budget narrative for the staff that are on that personnel page as well to really tell us why each of them are necessary to operate this program. And, these are their usual, salaries. This is the market rate for those kinds of roles. Now, next Wednesday, we're going to dig down into indirect costs in some detail. But just to recap, the difference between direct and indirect costs. Direct costs are those that can be directly attributable to the funded program. Those are each of the line items that you'll see in the detailed budget. Indirect costs are those expenses that support the overall agency operation and that are much more difficult to directly attribute to each program that agency operates. So these are directly attributable to the program. Now, agency executive staff are typically treated as those indirect costs because their work supports the agency as a whole. Rarely do they really support just one program, or is it really easy to tease out exactly how much of their work is supporting each program. Now, some smaller agencies, new startup agencies, sometimes seek to charge executive staff as a direct cost because they have a much smaller, operation. And so it may be possible for them to figure out exactly how much of that executive's work is directly attributed to each program. I will remind you that if any staff that are charged as personnel, they're charged as a direct expense, that they also have to submit timesheets that justify their time on the grant, that document the work that they're doing. Now, the question of how we assure that the costs of executive salaries and benefits are charged as direct costs. How do we do that, and how do we make sure that it's both reasonable and necessary? We actually developed an executive compensation policy to do just that. So we've established limits on the rate of pay and the percentage of time that executive staff may be charged to grants as a direct expense. Those limits don't apply if the executive salaries and benefits are charged as part of the indirect, where it's not directly attributable. So we're only executive compensation deals with executive staff, and by that I mean the executive director, the chief financial officer, your comptroller. When those staff are charged as a direct expense, they're a line item on that personnel page. So this executive compensation policy establishes standards for the rates of executive compensation. And we did that by procuring a national survey of executive compensation. And we took this big national survey and we stripped out all the information for Illinois. And we've sorted that information by both the role of the executive and by the region of the state. We know that, an executive director's may be able to command a higher salary in Chicago than they do in Pekin, for instance. So we have sorted the information by both the role and by the region of the state to establish those expected maximum rates of compensation. If when we do that analysis, the cost that you want to charge your executive director as a direct expense to the grant agreement, if it exceeds our policy, if it exceeds the tool that's established, the standard that's established in that tool, then the grantee can lower the percentage of time that's charged as a direct expense for the executive director, and then just pay the remaining costs out of another non-authority source. So it's not like you can lower it in one grant and then charge it to another authority grant, because we're looking overall. The authority as a whole doesn't want to support more than that standard that's been established. In very limited circumstances, grantees may request an exception to that policy, but they're really going to have to justify why that exception will be necessary. What happens if the executive is charged at a higher percentage of their time? Then we'll ask the grantee to complete this executive compensation checklist, which details that executive's duties, like how do they spend their time? And then we'll use that tool to come up with a maximum percentage of their time that can be charged to the grant agreement. And again, in very limited circumstances, we'll consider an exception to that percentage that we calculate using this tool. I forgot to stop and ask for questions. I'll do that right after this last slide. Now, to help you through all of this cost allowability that we've touched on today, in the follow-up email, I'll be sending you our cost allowability guide, our food policy, our travel policy, our transportation policy, as well as the executive compensation grantee guide. So you'll have those tools that will supplement the information that we've covered today. Aisha, I should have stopped a couple of times along the way. I bet you there's some questions.
There's no problem. There's just one question. And is do all 1099 staff have to go through the state's contractor approval process?
Well, any contractor will be subject to procurement. And so there are a number of different levels that we've established. If the, based on the value of the contract, is it $1 million contract or is it a $2,500 contract? The type of contractor, for instance, if there's a training, we'll ask you for additional information on the training and the curriculum, the qualifications of the trainers, things like that. If it's the lease, we just want to make sure that it was competitively procured and it's an arm's length transaction. So you're not you're not contracting with another arm of your own organization because that's not competitive. So when you're talking about procurements as a whole, it's a little more difficult to really drill down on that. We do have a session later on in the Thursday series where we talk about contracts and sub awards. So that's in a couple of weeks on Thursday. I'll be sure to attach the training schedule again so that you can double check which date we're going to talk about subcontracts. Any other questions?
Yes. What are the executive limits and rates?
We're going to have all of that in the executive compensation guide that we're going to send to you. I kind of don't want to dig down into the detail right now because it is a little complicated. So I think if we, let me put a pin in that. And when we talk about indirect costs next Wednesday, we'll double back to that and let me know if you have any questions about the executive compensation guide that we're going to send you this afternoon.
Okay, next question. If subcontractors need supplies to meet the program needs, would that be an allowable cost or allowable expense?
Um, I think it depends on the typically that would be something that is included in their contract, right? So that's like kind of the package that you're procuring from them. Um, if it's, something that's going to be used by the trainees at your agency, you need, I don't know, some book or something that is that you have to procure, some workbook or something. That's something that will be used by your staff or by your participants. That could be on the supplies page, but oftentimes the trainer supplies any materials that they need for that contractual service. It depends on exactly how you structure that contract.
Okay, one last question.
Yes, ma'am.
If 1099 staff already work with the agency, do we still have to go through procurement?
Um, I would say, mm, I think it depends on the 1099 staff. Again, it really does depend. That's why so much of it is in this in this execution process that we're going through. It really does depend on exactly what that contract is. And if you've got if it's the accountant that does work for the program, that does the work for it, that 1099, I think that you could justify that that's an established 1099 staff person. And I would, again, we may need to prorate, like if they're already working for your program, how much of their services are for this program as opposed to, other programs they're already working on before you got this grant. So you may be prorating the services that they provide. So there's a lot of kind of questions that we go through at this stage to tease out that information. We're not, and when you watch the subcontract one, you'll see that a lot depends on the type of service that's being procured, the type of contract it is, and the size of the contract. So stay tuned for that. Any other questions, Aisha?
Last one. Are all
Okay.
grant staff required to live in Illinois?
No, especially we have a lot of organizations that are near the borders of Illinois. The authority itself has staff that, live in Indiana. So there's no requirement that they live in Illinois, especially now that a lot of work is done, remotely. There's no standard that I know of. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Aisha, before we kind of wrap it up, or any other questions?
Nope, I think you've covered everything. We can move forward.
Okay, great. So as you saw in last week's training, and you're going to see in all the rest of the trainings, we really do appreciate it when you send us, when you complete this survey after each session to tell us how we're doing and to let us know what other information it is that you'd like to have. So I'm going to be sure to include the link to this survey in that follow-up email as well. And the next trainings tomorrow, we're going to talk about GATA compliance and special conditions that you may see in your grant agreement. And then next Wednesday, as I said, we're going to talk about indirect costs and documenting your expenses for the grant. Any other questions?
There
Aisha, do
aren't
you?
any additional questions in the
Great.
chat, giving people an opportunity to populate additional questions if they have them. For those of you all who have indicated that you have not heard from your assigned grant specialist, if you can put your organization's name in the chat, and then I can reach out to that grant specialist and give them a little nudge. Is the link the same for tomorrow's meeting, Maureen?
No, they should have received a separate set of invitations. Everyone should have received, everyone who's on our contact list should have received a set of invitations for Wednesdays for this track 2, and then a set of invitations for Thursday sessions as well. And if you haven't received the invitations, you want to be on the contact list, because it's the folks that are on the contact list get those invitations and they get the follow-up emails as well. Then please use that cja.r3training@illinois.gov email address and drop us a line, and I'll make sure that you're on the contact list. There were a couple other questions it looked like, Aisha.
Yeah. Is there room to edit the budget to update the need for indirect costs?
Well, bear in mind that the amount that you're allocated is the amount that you're allocated. So if you need to charge indirect costs now, what other costs in your line item are you taking away? Because we're not going to, those allocations are not going to grow because you've identified the need to charge indirect costs. Any other questions, Aisha?
Can you reshare the difference between track 1 and 2 again?
Sure. The track 1 trainings are kind of like, we see them as like grants 101. Kind of last week we took you through the overview of the grant as a whole, all the steps we're going to take to until we get you all closed out. So we're going to talk in detail about things like how you the dispersal methods that we use, how dispersals will come to you, how you're going to get paid. That's through the PFR, which is our periodic financial report that you'll be submitting. And that's the tool that we use to make payments to you. We're going to have a session on the PPR, which is the programmatic performance report. And that's where you're going to tell us all the good work that you're doing. And we're going to be seeing the progress that you're making towards the goals, objectives, and performance measures that are outlined in your agreement. We'll have a session on subawards and subcontracts. So be sure to tune in for that one where we'll go through all of the detail on the procurement process and on subawards. We'll talk about site visits. We'll talk about budget revisions. Those are all like the basics of the grants. And then track 2, our Wednesday sessions, are where we're going to dig down into the details like we did today of some of the issues that we know have been more challenging to grantees over the past. So we wanted to kind of give you the Grants 101 here and then supplement it on Wednesdays with a little more of the nitty-gritty detail of what you're going to be encountering as we go through the grants. Next week, we're going to talk about indirect costs and going to be how you are going to be sure that you are documenting your expenses. So we want to set you up in a good place so that you get your grant off the ground and you can be successful going forward. Any other questions?
So Melody asked, what days are track 1 on?
Yep, track 1 is Thursdays at 10. Track 2 is Wednesdays at 11.
And then someone said, I think you mentioned this on the last webinar. When should we send a revised budget to our grant specialist? Key dates and deadlines are helpful. Thanks.
Okay, so if you're talking right now, we're just setting your initial budget, right? So you're going to be working one-on-one with the assigned grant specialist as they review your materials. They'll have some questions like we talked about in today's session on things that need clarification or need further support or need some revision. You're going to be working to establish this initial budget. And that's what we're going to be sending on to our fiscal office and our legal office, and that will become part of your grant agreement. Then it'll be done. Then you can start spending. If you need throughout the course of the agreement to revise your budget, if someone left the staff and you had a 3-month lapse in personnel, that means you've got some funding that's available and you have a good reason, a good way to rebudget those funds. You want to revise the initial budget that we're putting together right now. We're going to have a session on budget revisions. That's a little bit later in the Thursday sessions, but we'll go walk you through that process. And it does typically take, you should always allow, I would say minimally, like about 30 days for that budget revision process to pan out until you'll have the approval and can start incurring those costs. But right now our focus is on building this initial budget, and that you'll be working one-on-one with your grant specialist with. Let's see.
How many times can you revise the budget?
Well, we don't expect you to be revising it every month. I mean, we want you to, it would be unusual to have multiple budget revisions because we want you to be doing, your costs aren't probably that dynamic that they're going to be changing that often. I would say it's not uncommon to have one budget revision throughout the course of a grant agreement, the 12 months. In rare circumstances, we've seen 2, but that's when something completely like unforeseen happened, or some cost was really, the cost estimate was really out of scale. When we're revising the budget, bear in mind as well that we're just reallocating the line items, and we're not adding funds to the grant. That's not a budget revision. It's just the reallocation of the existing dollars. I see this question from Evan. By when do we need this initial budget done in order to obtain our necessary approvals by a November 1st start date? I think we talked a little bit about it last time. After you and your grant specialist kind of come to agreement on this budget, then they send it over to fiscal, then they send it over to legal, and then it will come to you for signature, and you'll have to approve the NOSA, the Notice of State Award, in the GATA portal. Once those steps are complete, then it comes back to us. Legal takes one final review before they send it on to our executive director for signature. So that's why we wanted to spend some time at the very beginning of this execution process, talking about some of these common issues that come up as you're nailing down this initial budget and working through these fine details. So we wanted you to have this information up front, because the sooner we come to this agreement on the budget and can pass it on to fiscal and legal for their approval, and they may find something that we didn't or have some other questions they want, more fully explained. The more efficient we are at this stage of working on that budget, the closer to November 1st you will be in getting that executed agreement. I think we've got all of the questions, Aisha. Do you see anything else we need to answer?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. My apologies. Looks like we have covered all of the questions that are in the chat.
Great. Then we're going to stop the recording now, and I'm going to send it. We'll close our session, and watch for that email from the cja.r3training@illinois.gov email with all this follow-up information. And we will double back to executive compensation next week when we talk a little bit more about indirect costs. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow.